Welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. I've had a latest request come through via my Patreon. Link to my Patreon in the description box below for those who are interested. And the request is from one of the new Patreon followers, Jairus. So many thanks to you for your support and for your question. I'm going to read out his message. Hey mate. One topic I'm interested in hearing your opinion on is the struggle for unification fights in the heavyweight division. Looks like Wilder, Parker and Joshua all say they're keen to have unification fights, but so far all the negotiations look like they're stalling or completely stopped. Would love to hear your opinion on all of that. For example, whether you think they should happen in 2018, what your opinion is on the proposed money splits, and what do you think of the approach of each champion? Do you agree, disagree with their stands? Do you think there needs to be more compromise, or do you think certain fighters and promoters' stances are fair enough? I couldn't quite remember yet if you've done an opinion piece on this topic, but could be good now that some of the unification negotiations seem to be losing a bit of steam compared to what they were a month or two ago, and what you think needs to happen to get them moving again. What do you think? So, good question. And once again, thank you to Jairus for sending it through. So, interesting timing for this one. Because Deontay Wilder was seen only last Friday, I believe it was, stepping into the ring after a Luis Ortiz fight and suggesting that Deontay Wilder was going to give Luis Ortiz another chance to fight him after their initial fight didn't progress because Luis Ortiz had performance-enhancing drugs issues. So the take seems to be that Deontay Wilder-Luis Ortiz fight is going to happen, which clearly means that Deontay Wilder is not going to be in a unification fight against either Joseph Parker or Anthony Joshua for his next matchup. As for the other two guys, Joshua versus Parker, I actually suspect that fight is still possible. You know, I know negotiations have been ongoing for quite some time. I know that we're yet to hear an announcement, and it kind of looks like it's been stalled. But negotiations for a fight of this magnitude can be extremely, extremely complex due to the amounts of money involved, the need to book massive stadiums at vast expense, the need to organise TV dates to fit in with the schedules of various broadcasters, both the UK and US, sponsorship deals that will be going on behind the scenes, etc, etc. So I don't think that Parker Joshua is out of the question, and the negotiation points of the two guys actually seem to be getting closer. So David Higgins, Duco, Joseph Parker's team seem to have been standing by this fact that they want 35% of the purse for that fight. Whereas Anthony Joshua and Eddie Hearn, according to the Duco side, seem to be talking about 30%. So there's not a huge amount of distance between the two guys. We're talking 30 and 35%. Perhaps there's some scope to meet in the middle, 32.5%. I know it sounds silly, but 2.5% is probably over $1 million, you know. So whilst it may seem like such a small gap between the two, we're talking about a substantial part of the pie that is still being negotiated over. But I think with goodwill, it will happen. I think both guys want and need a big fight, and I think they provide the opportunity to each other. I think one thing that's key throughout these negotiations is Parker, well, certainly from Parker and Wilder's standpoint, is Anthony Joshua is the meal ticket. He's a once-in-a-lifetime payout. You know, we know how much Joseph Parker and Deontay Wilder have been fighting for in the past. We know that, you know, fight paydays of $1 million, $2 million, $2.5 million, you know, somewhere between that $1 to $2 million bracket is fairly standard. We know that Anthony Joshua has been fighting for 15, 20 times that amount of money. Now, don't get me wrong, $1 million, $2 million fights, you know, that's not bad for a day's work. It's certainly more than old BG pulled in last month, let's put it that way. But what I will say is, yeah, when you have the opportunity to take an Anthony Joshua fight, that's a fight that can set you up for life. That's a fight that means you don't have to work again. That's a fight that means you can stop getting punched in the face for a living. And because it is such a one-time payment opportunity, and because it is a a sort of unique chance to earn money to change your life, your family's life, your children's life, your children's children's life, it's no surprise whatsoever that these negotiations are fraught. And it's no surprise that the negotiations are pretty difficult, because from Joshua's perspective, he can earn $20 million fighting Carlos Takam. So from a pure financial and commercial standpoint, he needs these fights less than Wilder and Parker. Anthony Joshua is already set up for life. Anthony Joshua can fight Dillian Whyte and Kubrat Pulev next year and probably earn $50 million between the two. So, it's the standard for Joshua to be earning these kind of paydays. And from his perspective, yeah, he'd get a little bit more to fight Parker and Wilder, but there's a huge amount of risk there. So, maybe that's why he's not inclined to be chucking out the big splits. Whereas from a Wilder and a Parker perspective, they need to get this negotiation right, because if they don't get this fight, if they don't get this meal ticket, for want of a better term, they're going back to fighting for $1 and $2 million. And this is heavyweight boxing. Let's say Luis Ortiz lands a haymaker on Deontay Wilder and sparks Deontay Wilder out. Let's say the Deontay Wilder dream comes crashing down just like that. Well, if that's the case, then what a missed opportunity it would be to fight for Anthony Joshua for all the percentages and all the money that you can get. So where we are, Parker wants 35%, Wilder wants 50%. Now, whether that's the final negotiation figures for those guys, only they know. But those are the two numbers that are being mooted. Now, it's very hard to say, do I think those splits are fair? Do I think those splits are reasonable? From a pure commercial standpoint, if you take the overall number that a fight with Wilder and Joshua or Joshua and Parker is worth, and you say, who is bringing that commercial? Who is bringing the ticket sales? Who is bringing the pay-per-view sales? Then the honest answer is no. Deontay Wilder isn't worth 50%. Joseph Parker isn't worth 35%. That's a mathematical, commercial call from my side. Now, look, I don't have access to the Matchroom accounts. I don't have access to the Anthony Joshua accounts. I'm not speaking factually here with proof and with evidence. This is just my take on it. What I know is that AJ can sell out Wembley Stadium. He can sell out a 90,000 seat stadium with demand for tickets. In addition to that 90,000, I know Anthony Joshua can do in excess of 1 million pay-per-view buys for a fight of this magnitude in the UK market. I know Joshua has all sorts of sponsorship deals, both in the UK and internationally, and I know he's probably the biggest name in world boxing. You could maybe argue Manny Pacquiao, you could maybe argue Canelo Alvarez, but Joshua's probably the hottest ticket in town at this particular stage. So, from a pure mathematical perspective, you've got to look at what Joshua was doing fighting a guy like Carlos Takam, and you've got to say, what value is bringing a Wilder in or bringing a Parker in adding? And the answer there is yes, it's adding a substantial amount. You can sell it as a unification fight. It's going to do much higher pay-per-view buys. It's going to do international pay-per-view buys. I know New Zealand is a smaller territory, but Joseph Parker has something of a pay-per-view following in in New Zealand. Clearly, Deontay Wilder versus Anthony Joshua could bring a big pay-per-view buys in the US potentially, although that's somewhat of an untested market, as my understanding is Deontay Wilder is yet to make a pay-per-view debut in the US. So, from a pure commercial perspective, yes, they do add a lot of value. Do they add 35% in Parker's case, 50% in Deontay Wilder's case? Probably not. However, when you're looking to negotiate these splits, there's so much more that comes into it than just that. For a start, you have the fact that these guys are bringing belts to the table. Parker with the WBO, Wilder with the WBC. And, bringing those belts to the equation gives Anthony Joshua opportunity to further develop his own brand name and further develop his legend within the sport, by once again becoming a unified world champion and getting somewhere closer to being an undisputed heavyweight champion, which is a huge marketing tool. So the fact that those guys are bringing belts to the equation adds a lot. You've also got to factor in this dynamic where in boxing the mandatory challenger gets 25%, and there kind of needs to be some respect, some credence put behind the fact that these guys are not mandatory challengers for Joshua's belts. They are defending champions in their own right, and as such, logically, they should be getting a higher cut than a mandatory challenger like a Carlos Takam or a Kubrat Pulev. In terms of what I think I would say these guys are worth. I think that 30% for Joseph Parker is a fair value, and I think 40% for Deontay Wilder is a fair value. Why does Deontay Wilder deserve more? I think there's a few reasons. Number one, I think globally he is held in higher regard than Joseph Parker. Certainly his highlight reel knockout streak means that he's considered more of a threat, rightly or wrongly. The US is clearly a much bigger territory than New Zealand, and the potential for selling that fight on pay-per-view in US is much higher commercially than selling such a fight in New Zealand, where the population is smaller, etc. And I also think Deontay Wilder is just a more marketable guy out of the two. He's a louder guy. He hypes the fight better. He's an excellent talker. His style is extremely marketable. And you kind of think that Deontay Wilder press conferences against Anthony Joshua could be worthy of pay-per-view buys alone. Whereas with Joseph Parker, he's a quieter, more respectful type figure. And he probably doesn't bring the same hype and the same build to a fight that you would see with the Deontay Wilder. So, yeah, my take would be in terms of fair percentages. 30% for Parker, 40% for Wilder is about right. But as I say, that's just my gut instinct. That's just me shooting from the hip without, having fully investigated and researched the numbers involved. As for the approaches of both guys, Joshua's kind of sitting back and waiting. I've seen Joshua saying, if you want this fight so much, make me an offer. And I think that's a fair comment from Joshua. There's this whole assumption that Anthony Joshua and his team will make offers to Parker and Wilder. But yeah, if Parker and Wilder think that they deserve so much of a split, yeah, they're more than welcome to make an offer to Anthony Joshua, which he can then accept or decline. Now, I know David Higgins has taken to Twitter to make an offer to AJ, but you kind of wonder how solid that is. This is a guy with no history, as far as I'm aware, of doing big fights like this in the UK, and you kind of question whether or not, when Higgins is making an offer by Twitter, it's actually going to correspond to tens of millions of dollars in Anthony Joshua's bank account. Just my opinion there. As for Deontay Wilder and Parker calling out for higher splits, you kind of wonder if that's a negotiation technique. And if it is, fair enough. If Deontay Wilder's saying he wants 50% to get AJ to come up to 40%, that's a solid technique. If Higgins is saying Parker needs 35% in order to get AJ to go up to 32 or 33%, then again, that's a solid technique. David Higgins has received a lot of criticism for looking kind of amateurish, the way they've called out Anthony Joshua, that sort of highlight video they had, the famous press conference where they were talking about Anthony Joshua being chinless, and it was a sort of low budget, slightly amateurish production, that is true. However, it did create hype around the fight. It helped build and add weight to Joseph Parker's brand, and it has continued to mean that this fight, Parker versus Joshua, is getting talked about and is more on people's lips than it's ever been in the past. So, you have to give him some respect for doing that. As for Deontay Wilder, whilst negotiations there do seem to have stalled, that whole calling into the boxing voice and, going at Eddie Hearn when Eddie Hearn was live on the show, yet again, that's another great bit of promotion. He's done a great job of convincing people that Joshua's ducking the fight, that Joshua and his team are running scared. I think the perception among many boxing fans is that it's AJ who's ducking the fight. And, again, fair play goes to Deontay Wilder for building that hype. If Deontay Wilder's final stance is that 50% of the purse needs to go to him for him to take the fight, then you wonder if he's pricing himself out. You wonder if he actually wants the fight. But as we discussed on my podcast last week, it's kind of unclear whether that actually is his final stance. He's saying it's his final stance, but is he saying that to get a higher percentage offered to him? Deontay Wilder getting 50% of the purse does seem so unreasonable given the difference in values that the two guys bring to the ring, that if he refuses to negotiate whatsoever on that, he's kind of meaning that the fight almost certainly isn't going to happen. And with that in mind, you kind of have to question whether he wants to fight, because it is so unrealistic. But perhaps it shouldn't be too quick to judge him. Perhaps we should wait and see if further negotiation does ensue. It's perhaps, in terms of timings, from a Wilder Joshua fight, which is the bigger fight globally, as we've discussed, it's no bad thing to have Wilder fight Ortiz AJ fight, Parker, and assuming both guys come through those fights, it will only build, it will only become a bigger fight globally and internationally. Maybe there's some sort of constructed plan behind the scenes. I don't know. I understand why Wilder didn't want to fight Dillian Whyte. You know, I understand that he felt disrespected. I do think that fight would have made the AJ fight bigger. I think it would have helped to develop Wilder's fan base within the UK market, which is where a lot of the money for this fight is. And I do think it would have built more hype around his name even than exists already. So I do think that whilst I can see why Deontay Wilder doesn't want to have to defend his belt against Dillian Whyte, I do think that was a fight he should have considered further from a business perspective. As for the Parker fight, I wouldn't be surprised if that fight happens at all spring of 2018. You know, a lot of the rumblings I hear suggest that that fight could well be coming next, in fact. Is it the right time? I think age is a factor to consider. You know, Joshua and Parker are young guys. They could hang around the peripheries, build their brands even more. I don't think that's a fight that needs to happen next time out, although I understand both guys will want a big fight and will want to earn big money as usual. With the Deontay Wilder fight, I actually do think there's slightly more urgency around that fight because Wilder's an older guy. You know, Wilder, let me have a look at how old he actually is now. Deontay Wilder is, he's 32, so he's not old, but he is older, certainly, than Joshua and Parker. And with his style being so based around power, athleticism, speed, you kind of get the impression that Wilder's not going to be a better fighter at 35 than he is at 32. He's not going to be a Mayweather and a Hopkins who's still at the top of his game at 40. So I think with Wilder, there is a ticking clock element to his game. You know, he's had 40 fights already. He's 32 years old. For him, you want this fight to happen in the next year or so. You don't want Deontay Wilder getting into the ring to fight Joshua at 35 and people saying, like they were saying last night with Rigondeaux, you know, is he past his best? You know, is he going to lose against a younger opponent because age is a big factor? You want to strike when the iron is hot, and Deontay Wilder, Joshua both look like they're peaking at this stage. From Parker's perspective, frankly, whilst I understand commercials are important and Parker wants to get the money when it's hot, I do think Parker would still benefit for 2 or 3 more fights. Parker still makes mistakes that, for me, haven't been ironed out in his game. We've seen them coming on the way up. We've seen them into Cam, Ruiz, Hughie Fury. Some of his failure to fully commit to his jab, some of his defensive openness, you kind of get the impression that could be worked on. You kind of get the impression maybe with a new trainer or change of scenery, there could still be more to come from Joseph Parker. I don't look at Joseph Parker and think he's the finished article. And that's not to say he's worse than Wilder or Joshua. It's to say that Joseph Parker is this good. I believe he has the potential to be this good. You know, there's a bit more room for growth in Parker's game, which kind of ties in with the fact he's a younger guy. You know, with Joshua, with Deontay Wilder, you look at them, they do have their frailties, but you kind of wonder if that's as good as they're going to get. You know, they're at their peaks at this stage. They're not young. They've had their learning fights at this stage. You know, Joshua's already proved it at the highest level, and you just kind of wonder if what they've got is what they're going to have throughout their entire career. So, funnily enough, I think the Parker fight is the one that's more likely to happen next. And I think actually that's the one that could be left to marinate for a bit longer, because there's no aging fighter there in their 30s who you think's going to have to strike when the iron's hot. You know, I look at that Wilder fight and I do think there's a bit more urgency attached to that. But I understand why Parker wants to fight. I understand he hasn't earned superstar money in his career to date. And I understand he probably thinks he can beat Anthony Joshua. And if he gets to fight with Joshua, he's going to earn an 8-figure payday. He's going to earn a payday that puts him up for life and means he doesn't have to fight again. And if he can beat Joshua, and obviously if the fight is announced, we will cover that extensively in supplementary videos. But if he can beat Anthony Joshua, from a rematch perspective, Parker's going to be looking at a 20, 25, $30 million payout. And that's when, you know, we're talking superstar bucks. That's when we're talking some of the biggest purses in the sport of boxing in 2018. So, yeah, that's my thought. Let me just go back to the question and see if I've answered all the elements of it. Whether they should happen in 18. So, I think the Wilder fight should happen in 18. I don't think the Parker fight needs to happen in 18. But I think there is an element of taking the money when it's there. You know, this is heavyweight boxing. If AJ got chinned by someone, if Parker got chinned by someone, yeah, one punch can change a career in heavyweight boxing. So there is an element, if that money's there, take it when it's in front of you. But there's also an element that, you know, there's no rush with these two. But I think the Wilder fight needs to happen. What's your opinion on the proposed splits? Well, I think 30% for Parker's fair, 40% for Wilder's fair. What do you think of the approach of each champion? Do you agree with their stands? Does there need to be more compromise? Or do you think certain fighters and promoters' stances are fair enough? I think in terms of the compromises, with Wilder, there needs to be some compromise from his 50% stance, because that is unrealistic. And for me, if he stands by that, that will give the impression he doesn't actually want to fight, because it's so unrealistic, given his value in the fight commercially and what he brings to the table. That I hope that's a negotiation technique. With Parker, he's coming at 35%, which is fair. Maybe there needs to be compromise, but you know, if the likes of Eddie Hearn are going in at 30%, you're talking a compromise of 1% or 2, which is hopefully manageable. Either way, let's hope these fights get made. If they do get made, it's going to be a hugely exciting time for heavyweight boxing, and these are going to be some of the biggest fights out there. Just one final comment. We don't hear about Wilder fighting Parker anymore, you know, and I think that kind of shows some of the value of Anthony Joshua in this fight and in this equation, because all the time you used to hear, oh, maybe Wilder will fight Parker. Clearly they've had a look at that fight. Clearly that fight's been discussed behind the scenes, and clearly the money in that fight pales into insignificance compared to the money each guy could earn from the from the Anthony Joshua fight, and that kind of tells you a little bit of something, I think. Anyway, I'm rambling. 21 minutes in. Let me call it a day there. Joris, I hope that answers your request. I hope that covers the various bits. Thanks for watching, everyone else. Appreciate you tuning into my channel. Please hit the thumbs up button. Please hit subscribe if you haven't done so already. You can give me a follow on Twitter at Boxing Gossip. Cheers, guys.